Hello everyone, this is Mark Humphreys and I just want to talk to you briefly about the second year module CLH230, the Heirs of Rome, which is all about how the Roman Empire of antiquity was transformed into Western Christendom, Byzantium and the Islamic Caliphate between the years 400 and 800. In this short presentation I want to focus though on one particular aspect, which is how during this period, we also see climate change, we see the outbreak of pandemic disease, and we might even see some self-isolation happening in the 6th century. The main focus of the module is to examine the political and cultural transformations that saw the Roman Empire of the Mediterranean world in antiquity transformed into a number of different polities. In the West, we have the emergence of what are called the barbarian kingdoms, for example, kingdoms ruled by Franks, Goths, Vandals, and so on. In the East, you have the Roman Empire surviving in the form that historians call the Byzantine Empire, although the inhabitants of that empire always called themselves Romans. And then from about the 7th century onwards, we have the emergence of Islam with huge territorial gains taken by the Muslims, leading to the carving out of an Islamic caliphate that stretched from Spain and North Africa right across the Mediterranean world and through the Middle East and into Central Asia, as far as places like what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan. But the story is not just one of political and cultural transformation. There are other things happening too, and some of these have rather spooky modern resonances. This year, my teaching of the module was interrupted by the outbreak of the coronavirus epidemic and the locking down of society, including universities. And the whole story of the virus has dominated the news for the last month or so. But of course, that's not the only virus that is confronting us in 2020. Also confronting us are the problems posed by various forms of environmental crisis, and in particular, human-driven climate change. So we're living at a time of various types of challenge to our survival, from changes in the climate and the environmental effects of those, and also from the spread of the coronavirus epidemic. And what's particularly interesting is that this was a set of challenges that also confronted people in the period covered by this module. And in particular, the 6th century saw the outbreak of a number of crises, both of climate change and of widespread disease, that may have had a huge influence on human societies around the Mediterranean and in the Near East at this time. There were two major types of environmental crisis that unfolded in the 6th century. The first, which appeared in the middle of the 530s, is known as the Dust Veil event. This was probably the result of a volcanic eruption somewhere in Asia, which threw a huge amount of volcanic debris up into the atmosphere, which spread out around the northern hemisphere and caused a dimming of sunlight and led to much colder temperatures. And this, in turn, seems to have provoked a longer-term cooling of the climate, which put the agricultural societies of this period under a great deal of strain. There was an increased incidence of crop failure, and with that a threat of famine that lasted from the 6th century down until the 8th century. And just a few years later, as societies around the Northern Hemisphere were dealing with the challenge posed by the dust veil and the cooling of the climate, there was the outbreak of a pandemic disease known as the Plague of Justinian. This started in Egypt, at least according to our sources, but soon spread elsewhere. And it recurred in waves for the next 200 years. And the evidence that we have suggests that in various places there were high rates of mortality. In some places, communities may simply have collapsed and disappeared. And this put a great deal of pressure on state resources, not least economic resources. Now, for these frightening events of a cooling of the climate and the outbreak of disease, we have a number of important witnesses. From the west, from the kingdom of the Franks, what used to be Roman Gaul, we have the writings of Gregory of Tours, a bishop and a historian. From neighbouring Italy, we have the works of a senator and civil servant, Cassiodorus, who was, in spite of his Roman background, working as an agent of the Ostrogothic kings who ruled Italy in the 530s. And then from the Eastern Empire, from Constantinople, we have the views expressed by one of the greatest historians of the period, the historian Procopius, a major source for the reign of the Emperor Justinian. Starting with Cassiodorus, in a letter that he wrote in 537, written to a Gothic king of Italy, advising him on how to respond to contemporary challenges, we have an interesting insight into how the Ostrogoths and their ministers sought to control food shortages and to deal with the problem of posed by famine. This shows that one thing that Cassiodorus was doing was advising his king on how to avoid the sort of panic buying that we've seen recently in our own supermarkets. Cassiodorus, writing to the Gothic king in 537, mentions that crops have failed, and mentions that what the king should do is to make an effort to store up supplies from the previous years when there had been quite bountiful harvests, and as a result of storing this up, the king should be able to guarantee food supply and to counteract the tendency of individuals to hoard supplies, to hoard food, with the possible result of major troubles for society more broadly. So there's one echo of the sort of things that we're experiencing now. Not all governments, though, were quite so sympathetic. For example, when Justinian's empire was ravaged by the plague from 541 onwards, we're told in a rather vitriolic account in the Secret History by Procopius that far from being sympathetic to his subjects who were suffering as a result of the ravages of the plague, Justinian instead tried to think of business as usual and tried to continue to exact taxation even from taxpayers who were suffering from the effects of plague, and in particular he demanded that agricultural communities should pay the same amount of tax as in previous years, even though farmers had died and there were fewer people to pay that tax. So in contrast to the rather enlightened activities of the Ostrogothic king, advised by the Roman senator Cassiodorus, here we have the East Roman emperor behaving in a merciless fashion. And my final voice comes from Gaul, comes from the kingdom of the Franks in 563, when Gregory of Tours describes in Book 4 of his histories an outbreak of the plague at the city of Clermont in the Auvergne. This was Gregory's home territory. Now, Gregory was a bishop, and his histories are influenced by his Christian outlook. He was always looking for examples of good Christian behaviour. And what we have here is a good example of that, when he describes how a priest called Cato died having caught the plague, but died having rendered charitable service to other people who were suffering from the plague. Gregory tells us that although many people had fled from Clermont, Cato the priest never did, but he remained courageously burying the people and celebrating Mass. Gregory remarks that he was a priest of great kindliness and a warm friend of the poor. And even if one might think that Cato had some element of pride, Gregory's view is that virtue counterbalanced it. So in Cato, we have an example of a Christian priest behaving well. In stark contrast to Cato's behaviour, Gregory describes the conduct of the Bishop of Clermont, Cartinus. Now, Cartinus was frightened out of his wits by the outbreak of the plague, and we're told that he fled from Clermont, and he ran from place to place in fear of the plague. But there was no escape for him. In the end, he returned to Clermont, he caught the plague there, and he too died. So Gregory uses the story about the plague to tell stories about, on the one hand, the inspiring leadership provided by Cato the priest, and on the other hand, the much less impressive conduct of Cartinus the bishop. So what we see in this period is not just a period of significant political and cultural transformation, but also a period that has some interesting echoes with our own times, as we've seen here with evidence for changing climate and the stress that that's putting on society, and also for the outbreak of pandemic disease and the stresses that that causes. So there's a lot to be learned from this period, a lot for us to examine. And it's not all just political history. There's interesting things going on. And along the way, you'll find out not just about emperors, about barbarian kings, about civil servants, about bishops and priests. You'll also find out about harlots and prostitutes, all sorts of interesting characters. Indeed, you even find that this period gives us our first instance of no less a creature than the Loch Ness Monster. But if you want to find out more about that, you'll have to sign up for the module.